So this is an overview of Environment and Climate Change Canada's modeling work, and a bit towards the end on network analysis, which is a new thing that we're getting into. Let's see. Ah, good. Okay, so I'll start off with sort of an introduction to the model that we use in Environment Canada, which is called GEM-MACH, and the version that we're using up till September of this year, and then the new version. And it's quite an impressive change in how well the model performs between those two versions. And then I'll talk about a few things that we're doing, sort of a scattershot approach to all the different projects, the sub-projects that are going on using that model. The next steps is talking about the network analysis and where things are with that, and some plans of where we're going. So this model was first described by my colleague Mike Moran in 2010, and it's been compared to a bunch of other models that are at a similar level. These are what are known as online chemical transport models. It's sort of a fourth generation model, and you can do things like take a look at how the air pollution affects the meteorology and vice versa, see the extent to which you can change the weather by changing the pollution. It has a number of different components. These are all just standard things in an air quality model of this nature, looking at different kinds of processes, the gas chemistry, the aqueous phase chemistry, and so on. And there's options for feedbacks, as I mentioned, between weather and air pollution in it. So that was the setup that we were using up until this September. And there's 2-bin and 12-bin versions. That's for the 12-bin takes more processing time on our supercomputer, but it gives you a more detailed look at how the aerosols behave. And I've talked about the emissions there as well. So we basically had a system where we started with a 10-kilometer resolution outer domain that provides boundary conditions to the two inner domains. And the innermost one, that red block there, are a whole bunch of little 2.5-kilometer resolution grid squares showing where our high-resolution domain is. So that's what we've been running since 2012 as an experimental forecast. Now, when we did that comparison, here's my big table of numbers. This was back in December of last year. And when we went from the new version of the old version of the model to the new version, so it's called GMV1 in these columns. Each of these columns is a separate chemical, and all the stuff in the rows are different statistical metrics. And so when we went from the old version to the new version, a lot of things improved, and a lot of them improved quite drastically. The SO2 mean bias dropped by a factor of 3. The ozone, which had a bias of 8 parts per billion, went down to minus 0.25. These are big, big differences. They are big improvements. And so when we saw this after passing around the bottle of champagne, we then decided, well, we better get this going in our regular forecast after doing this test, and for things like our acid deposition work for the oil sands area as well. So the next 9 months thereafter, we're getting it all together and adding in new emissions and so on. So we're going to repeat some of the work that we've done in the past. I think my manager, Heather Morrison, talked about some of the acid deposition work in last year's symposium, and so that's going to be repeated with the new version of the model. But we've also switched our experimental forecast to it as well. So both of them are now using this version 2. That's a couple of the main improvements that we've got. But we've also updated the emissions data, so it's all 2013 now. We're still using the SEMA 2010 for some of the local allocations and so on for the oil sands area and for smaller sources. And also we've got some data from Alberta Environmental Parks for August and September for continuous emissions monitoring, so we can do some retrospective simulations with that. So the way it works now is we start off with our weather forecast for North America, and then, let's see if this, there we go, oops, sorry. There's no back, is there? Oh, there we go, okay. That feeds into 2 other models. So there's this cascade of models that are run to get to where we want to go. The one at the top is a high resolution, 2.5-kilometer weather forecast, and the one at the bottom is a 10-kilometer resolution air pollution forecast. Run those for 36 hours, and then those provide boundary conditions for a high resolution domain. That's that black block there. And then we come up with that as a blow up of that little black block, our high resolution air quality, and this particular field is SO2. Now, I'm not sure if I can run this properly. I'm trying to figure out how the mouse works on this thing, or if it can, if there is even a mouse. There's a movie there that would be nice to show, but I'd have to get down to the bottom of it. But I can at least talk about the, oops, sorry, go back. Talk about the fields that are there. What's shown on here, there's sort of translucent green clouds, and those are SO2 concentrations, and then underneath it are SO2 dry deposition values from those clouds. Oh, there we go. Yeah, if you could move over to the left. Thank you. There we go. They're hourly values, and this is just from the forecast from October 19th, just as an example. So each individual image is an hour apart, and the SO2 dry deposition accumulates over that time. So the model does its thing. It works out where clouds of SO2 are going to go. And as part of that, you can work out for this particular chemical what the SO2 dry deposition would look like. And so those things can feed into critical load exceedance calculations and so on. So I've got about 4 slides here of just individual little process studies that have been going on. I shouldn't call them little. These are different people who are working with the model and their modeling capability. The one on the left is just the idea that air quality modeling was used to help test out different ways of understanding how organic aerosol forms in the oil sands. And one thing you can do with a model is if you think it works in one way, you can try that out, see how it compares to the observations. If you think it's a different way that it works, you try out the different methodology. And there were a couple that worked. The observations are the blue diamonds on the left in that picture. And those 2 lines are the ones that worked. And those were telling us that intermediate volatility organic compounds are actually quite important there. So that's a renewed focus and something that we're trying to follow up on now. We've also been looking at the potential for acid aerosols influencing organic aerosol formation, and that's the series of plots on the right. There's one that's an organic plume on the left, an SO2 plume. So these were measurements from the aircraft, those 2 upper colorful pictures. And then we can use these as ways of checking out the extent to which the acid in the aerosols can influence the organic formation. So that's something that's still going on. And my colleague Craig Stroud is leading that work. We have a version of the model that's been used for Mercury simulations, and the point that things have got to now, there's 4 years of simulated high resolution, that's 2.5 kilometer resolution, Mercury chemistry and deposition. So I'm showing a few slides here that are from the evaluation which is going on right now of those model runs. The one on the left it's got the stations where Mercury was measured in the snow as little colored circles, and then the model values are the color contours around it. And we get the location fairly well and where the high values are. The one in the middle, the model is the red line and the observations are the blue line, and those are the observations the model have been averaged according to their distance from the center of the emissions area. And so we seem to get the fall off in Mercury fairly well. And then the last one is just an example from an individual station. And unfortunately here we've got the observations in the red and the model in the blue, but just how well the model captures some of the peaks in the overall annual trend. So that work's going on right now. We'll be looking at getting that published probably within the next 6 months to a year. There's a version that has been set up to do PAHs. It hasn't been applied to the oil sands area yet, but that's part of our plan for starting for next fiscal year. It's been used in the Great Lakes area, and it's being evaluated at the moment. So one of the things that we want to do is try it out and compare it to observations in the oil sands area. And we've also been looking at going into even higher resolution, 1 kilometer, nesting it down another level and seeing what that does. And these are just some examples comparing 2.5 kilometer on the left to 1 kilometer in the middle, and then the difference between the 2 on the right. And we see that we do get, for the higher resolution, it seems to improve accuracy once again. We want to compare that against aircraft observations. And our longer term plan is to try to nest down to this level in forecast mode as well. So the last thing that I'll spend a little bit more time on is the network analysis. And there's 2 parts to this. We're looking at monitoring networks, but also the model output. And there's a parallel project that AEP is working on, and Long Fu's got a poster about that, so you can check out his poster to see the methodology being used there. And part of what we're going to do is cross-compare between these 2 projects to see what we get in the end. There's 4 stages to this. Part of it, the first one, which is all completed now, is just checking out the methodology, but then use it on the AEP monitoring network data. And the idea with this one is to try to use the observations and different tools, mathematical and statistical tools, to tell us something about the extent to which the stations are the same, different from each other, are some potentially redundant, Now, this is just from a mathematical viewpoint, and you have other reasons for having two stations close together that may be related to compliance and so on. But what can it tell us about the system? The third and fourth stages are to try it out, exactly the same analysis now, but using the model output. And stage 3 is to see if we get the same results looking at the station locations, and if we do, then we move on to stage 4. And stage 4 will tell us things like if we had 100 monitors, for example, where would be the place to put them all where they'd represent a larger area and not each other in a sense. It's kind of exciting, very interesting stuff. So there are two stages to this in terms of the way that the analysis works, that is, as opposed to the way the study is working. First thing you do when you look at the observation data is you see that there's a lot of variability to it. And the blue line on this plot here, that's the ANZAC station, and that's the ozone for a year at ANZAC. And so the hourly values are up and down, up and down. If you start filtering out the short-term information, the hourly, the daily and less, and so on, you can generate the green curve, which gets rid of everything which is daily and shorter timescales. The yellow gets rid of weekly and shorter, and then the red one is monthly and shorter. So you can take a look at how the observations are varying on these longer timescales. Now you do this for all the stations, and then you can do things like compare these time series to each other. And you can calculate correlation coefficients between them. And then you take a look at the correlation coefficients, and you start grouping the stations. You put the most highly correlated stations together first. You combine these time series, and these are what's called a cluster, and then you repeat this process. So the number of stations that are part of clusters increases, and the number of clusters decrease the more iterations you do on this. But the result is a hierarchy. How similar the station observations are to each other. And you can plot them up as interesting trees, but they tell you which stations are very like each other, which ones are very different. And here's an example for all the ozone hourly monitoring stations in Alberta. I've got one of these tree diagrams being shown here. It's called a dendrogram, and it's been coded. Let's see, I think I got, yeah, there's a sort of a close-up of the correlation coefficients that are resulting. The vertical axis on these things is 1 minus the correlation coefficient. So stuff near the bottom, where those stations are linked together, those are highly correlated to each other. And you can take a look at the oil sand stations, which are all in red, and you can see they form a group by themselves. And the nice thing about all this sort of thing is that, having done it, I took the data in a blind sense, just ran it through the algorithm, and all these things came out which match what we know about the stations in the end, which is kind of neat to see. So that table gives the correlation coefficient at which the station separates out as a one-member cluster. If you're up at the top, they're poorly correlated with all the other stations. It means there's something unique about that station. If they're at the bottom, they're highly correlated with another cluster or other stations. So there's the potential for possibly redundancies there. Taking a look at that dendrogram again, here's an example of the kind of things you can pull out. There's a couple of stations near Fort Makar, that's Bertha-Ganter and Fort Mackay South, that have a high correlation. They're the highest of the lot. The next two are a couple near Edmonton. And then if you go on the other end of the scale, there's a station called Steeper that has low correlation. Now this is for ozone, and these diagrams change for each chemical and for each time scale. Steeper is kind of interesting because when I first talked about this with my colleagues in Alberta Environment, I said, okay, this one's different. Why? And they said, well, it's a high mountain site. It makes sense that the ozone would be different. But the analysis pulls things out, which gives some confidence that the analysis is actually giving us quite meaningful results. So we can summarize that kind of information, and I've shown a plot here, which is probably in too fine print for people at the back to see. But each of these are groups of the 4 highest correlated stations for all the different species that are in the hourly observations that AEP has. And I used a red font to show ones that happen to be in the WIBIA area, the Wood Buffalo Environmental Association area. And so there's some that show up as being highly correlated all the time. You have to watch, though, that's highly correlated compared to the rest in that group. And for some things like non-methane hydrocarbons, a high correlation might be 0.25 or something. For others like NO, it might be 0.81. So you have to be careful with that. And that reflects sometimes how well the measurement methodology is working. You can also go the other way and look for the stations with the lowest correlation values, and ANZAC, for example, shows up in that. And that can be due to a very different set of sources near that station versus the others. Sometimes you have to watch too to make sure that there aren't any measurement problems. We try to filter out stations that had issues like that. So you have to ask the question at the bottom, are there likely reasons why these stations might be so different from the others? So that's the second stage of a 4-stage project, and we're expanding it to take a look at some of the other types of observations over the next little while as well. And then we go on to the third and fourth stages, and that's towards the end of this fiscal year. Our fiscal year in Environment Canada goes from April through March. So we're going to try to get this model run finished, which is also going to be used for doing the acid deposition work, and try out exactly the same analysis at the station locations using model output. Do we get the same clustering? And if so, if the model seems to be showing some reasonable skill for that, then we can go on to the last one, which is to run it for every model grid point. You treat every model grid point as a separate station. And what that does is generate a map, and it allows you to answer the question, if you had 15 monitoring instruments, where would be the best place to put them? And best in this case is something like, to a given level of correlation, what would the air sheds look like? So you can use it to generate air sheds and common regions where you can put stations. So it's quite exciting stuff, but there's a lot of intense computation that would have to be done for that, so we're going to see about the methodology for it. So in the bigger picture then, where are we going? Well, this rerun that we're doing right now, that's going to be finished in January, and we're going to put it through Julian's critical load information, which he'll be talking about later on in the session, and just see what we're predicting for the acid deposition side of things. There's improved forecasts for the spring-summer monitoring intensive coming up, trying to get some of these new data into those. The new versions of GEM-MACH with the pHs and process updates, and we've also, just at the bottom, we started working on forest fire simulations at high resolution, so we're going to try to incorporate that into it as well. One of the scenarios that we want to do is to rerun, I mentioned there on 2C, aircraft observation-based estimates. So things like these data that Xiaomeng and his group have come up with, the idea is to put them into the model and compare them to our original data, to the new, and see how much of a difference that makes to the model results. And for some things, we know it's going to be quite a big difference. So that's the lot. So thank you for your interest.
My name is Kamrul from AEP. Just a short question. It was a very interesting figure for ANZAC ozone data when you filtered out from hourly to daily, monthly, and yearly. Just a short question. Is it a kind of a low-pass, high-pass notch filters that you developed, or it's just a running average on it?
It's a running average, but it's equivalent to a low-pass filter. There's a paper that was done by Fizio Salazzo et al., and about 4 or 5 papers in the literature that describe it. You can actually do a formal analysis and show that it's sort of it's a low-pass filter with, well, I can get into the technical details with you. It's not a very sharp low-pass filter, so you've got to be careful how you use it. But it's equivalent in a strict mathematical sense to a low-pass filter. And I think there was one back there somewhere. Oh, there we go, yeah.
Hi, I'm Carla Davidson. I work with Fort McKay First Nation. I had a question and a comment. First, to clarify, the correlations were done with the fully detrended data, is that correct?
Fully detrended data. The ones that I was showing examples for there are the hourly values, not the ones where I've taken out all that short-term variation, that sort of stuff. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's just taking the data itself and just running it with that. So I haven't tried an additional procedure to detrend it, no. What I've done is I'm comparing correlations with the hourly and the shorter variations taken out, but it's all within a year. So I haven't tried to do a correction to say, okay, if there's an average increase or something like that, I haven't taken that out, no.
Oh no, but I'm wondering, you showed the figure of taking out a lot of the periodicities, so the daily periodicities.
Yes, okay, yeah.
So, yeah, so it is, you've taken out all that variation.
Yeah, you can do, the examples that I was giving with the table, those are for the hourly. You can do exactly the same thing with the other ones. I just, not enough time. But I've done it for all those different time scales. So you get a different tree for the monthly values, and you find the correlations, not surprisingly, they all go up. The numbers increase when you start going to longer time periods.
Okay, that's interesting because my question, my follow-up to that is, are you concerned about losing some of the information, say, around the short-term poor air quality events? So the reason I ask is that a lot of these stations were put in not with the goal of understanding the larger ambient air quality situation, which is important, but also to understand the contribution of specific stations to local air quality, so more attribution type stations.
Sure, just quick response because he's going to yank me out. We can talk more later about it. The reason why we're doing it at the different time scales is because of the short time scale, you capture that sort of stuff. And when you compare the longer time scale to the shorter ones, you take a look at these stations and see how they drop out. You can see from the differences there the extent to which those short-term variations make a difference. We're seeing things like, we think we can pick out forest fires, for example, because they're events that are on the order of weeks to a month kind of thing. And those show up as differently, the clustering changes when you look at that. So that if you want to get that kind of stuff, you stick with the hourly, which is what I was showing you. Okay.